Good morning. I'm Matt Driskill, editor of Asian Aviation magazine and AsianAviation.com. Welcome to the latest In Conversation, sponsored by Metrojet of Hong Kong. Today we're talking to independent aviation analyst Brendan Sobie. Brendan, welcome to In Conversation. Thanks for joining me.
Thank you, Matt. Thanks for having me on this morning.
First things first, tell us about Sobie Aviation. You're an analyst, of course, but you also do consulting work with various clients. Give us the 50-cent tour.
Yeah, so I established Sobie Aviation in 2019, and I'm basically a research-focused consultant. So I do a lot of papers and studies and kind of thought leadership in the aviation space, primarily in Asia Pacific. And it's been an interesting time, obviously, because I established in 2019, and then the pandemic started in early 2020. So it's been very focused on, unfortunately, the massive impact and now the start of the recovery for the aviation sector.
Well, let's talk about that real quick, big picture, and then we'll drill down to the Asian countries. Things were actually sort of looking up October, November. Borders were starting to sort of creak open a little bit. Countries were doing away with quarantines for vaccinated travelers. And then the Omicron variant hit. It sounds like a great Star Trek show, but and every government's reaction was to either close the borders again, like Japan or Israel, or they reimpose quarantines. Here in Singapore, they're doing additional testing, which I think you've gone through and my wife is going through. What do things look like right now for the industry?
Yeah, I mean, it's rather mixed. Like you were saying, things were really looking up, particularly in November. It was definitely the tide was turning in Asia Pacific finally. It wasn't like a massive reopening like we saw maybe in other parts of the world earlier on, but it was finally the momentum was building. And I think a lot of countries, follow each other. So, once you had a few open up, the others felt more pressure to open up as well. And of course, higher vaccination rates in Asia, which were behind the other regions, with the exception of a few places like Singapore, that they were catching up as well, which is helping support the reopening. And everything all end of November because of Omicron, and now it's a bit mixed, I think, because there's the evidence on this new variant, and it won't be as serious, and then we could see improvement quite quickly, but it's kind of too early to know. And it's also mixed, I think, market by market, because some countries have really clammed up and are completely, and others have maybe are a little bit more cautious, but they're still reopening. So some markets are not as impacted, it's particularly domestically than others. But certainly in terms of an international perspective, we were only just starting the recovery, and that kind of has stalled now, and it remains to be seen if we're talking about a little bit of blip or if we're talking about a major impact. Hopefully it's more of the former than the latter, and I think so far indications would suggest that, but it's too early to know for sure.
We had a little bit of a technical difficulty there, but we're going to keep rolling, so everything's okay. I don't know if you've got kids that are running the Wi-Fi playing video games or something. Had a little bit of a dropout, but that's okay. Since COVID came about, we've all become sort of amateur virologists. And IATA's Willie Walsh said the other day that aviation's being made the poster child for COVID. And I bring that up because, again, governments, we had the Omicron come out, and by the time they closed the borders, the virus has already spread. Is aviation, in your opinion, do you think aviation is being unfairly penalized, or are governments doing the right thing?
Yeah, I guess it's a little bit of both. It's understandable why governments are cautious, but at the same time, a lot of reactions are not really based on facts or science, or rather knee-jerk. So in that case, when you see moves that just don't make any sense, certainly that's unfair, and it's certainly impacting aviation and travel sectors more than anyone else. But hopefully we'll kind of move on beyond this kind of stage where everything just kind of responds like that. I think, in the future, we're going to have new variants come out every few months potentially, so this is kind of going to become the new norm. And, this was the first new variant for several months, and kind of the first new variant since things really started reopening. So So in the future, hopefully, countries will stop doing this. But for now, that's not the case, unfortunately.
I want to ask a couple of. We'll get to Asia in just a second, but right before we went on the air, we were talking, and you mentioned that you had recently traveled. You spent a lot of time in the U.S. and then came back via the vaccinated travel lane. My wife also traveled recently. She went to the U.S., went to Europe. And everybody's been talking about the digital travel passes, the health, the IATA travel pass, the Commons project, the Commons pass. I personally had probably killed about 2 or 3 trees, printing out all of the various forms that were needed to comply with the different rules in the different jurisdictions. And I asked this of everybody that I've been interviewing. What happened to the standards? Why can't we all gather around for travel, the IATA travel pass, or, let's agree on some standards. A long time ago, we had the yellow card that everybody carried that was approved by the World Health Organization, approved by ICAO, showed your yellow fever vaccination status, and so on and so forth. We need the same kind of digital app, and there's dozens that are out there. How come we don't have any standards in the industry?
Yeah, I mean, it's an excellent question, and unfortunately, almost a year after these initiatives began with these travel passes, there hasn't been much headway. There's multiple passes out there, but there's no consensus. Countries just are doing their own thing. It's very unilateral. It's not multilateral, and that makes it very difficult to travel right now. It's extremely cumbersome. You have to, meet the regulations and the requirements of each individual country. If you're traveling to multiple countries, and maybe your wife was doing that, it makes it even more complicated. And you don't really see many people doing the multi-country itineraries right now, and that's very important, particularly in this region. Like Singapore, the whole tourism relies on multi-country itineraries because Singapore is a small place; it's a jumping-off point. So until you have initiatives globally or regionally, like at the ASEAN level, it just makes it very difficult. I mean, the EU is the one exception, but the EU of course, has an advantage because they already have this association of countries, so it's almost like one domestic market to begin with. But outside the EU, there's been really no consensus regionally, and there's of course no consensus globally. And this has to be resolved. Otherwise, international travel will really never resume to the extent that it was pre-COVID, because you'll just have these people who are traveling for essential reasons, who are willing to put up with the hassle and the cost of all these protocols and requirements. So we really need to have more consensus, otherwise the industry won't recover fully. And that's why you see associations like IATA continue to press on with these kinds of initiatives, and just a general idea of consensus between standards. It doesn't necessarily have to be one pass, but just general consensus between protocols, standards, and requirements.
Well, let's shift gears for a little bit. Let's talk about Asia. That's the region that we both live in. We're both here in Singapore, and it's really been hurt. China has a huge domestic market, of course. That seems to be coming back until you have new outbreaks in Beijing or Shanghai or wherever they happen to be, and then they lock down that area. Vietnam seems to be coming back a little bit. Australia seems to be headed in the right direction. Cambodia is opening up as well. Give us the big picture for Asia Pacific right before we take a break.
Yeah, so I mean, there's two markets to really look at, and both of them have been very different, and recovery timelines are different, and what we've seen so far is different. That's domestic and international. Then when you look at domestic, you look at kind of the major countries, which, there's 10 major domestic markets in Asia Pacific, and then the other countries really don't have domestic markets or have very small domestic markets. And what we've seen in those 10 domestic markets, over time, they've recovered in different with different timescales and at different successes so far, but they really, for the most part, overall, were really set back this year by Delta variant and the slow vaccination rates. So the domestic markets in Asia Pacific were behind, domestic markets in the rest of the world, with the exception of China, although China also has had a setback in recent months as well. So the domestic recovery has really lagged behind in basically almost all 10 of those major domestic markets, with the exception of China. And South Korea also has one of the smaller ones, has done quite well. But they were really lagging behind, and And now, particularly in the second and third quarter of this year, they were going down rather than up. They were going in the reverse direction. But now in the fourth quarter of this year, they've started recovering more. And even with Omicron, I think, Omicron probably will impact international a bit more than domestic. So domestic recoveries are looking quite good now compared to a few months ago, just generally speaking. And I think next year we'll see a full domestic recovery in a lot of these top 10 kind of Asia Pacific domestic markets. So that's the good news. International is another story. International traffic in Asia Pacific is still down over 90%. And it was just starting to pick up a little bit, but even that pickup was very small, and it's going to take a long time. And now Omicron kind of sets that recovery timeline back. It does vary a little bit by country. Obviously countries that have opened up are doing better than the countries that haven't. But even those countries that have opened up are, still their traffic is down, 80, 90%. So it's a long road to the recovery for the international markets, and that's where we, these issues with protocols and standards and requirements come into play. And it's just very tough, very difficult, very challenging, and it's going to be a long road, and it's going to be, lots of twists and turns and bumps on the way, as we've seen with Omicron.
Okay, Brendan, we need to take a quick break here to hear from our sponsor, Metrojet of Hong Kong. We'll be right back after this.
We're going to have the crown jewels of Asia, and I promise you we're going to have the nicest and busiest business aviation hangar in the region.
And we're back. We're in conversation with independent aviation analyst Brendan Sobie here in Singapore. Before the break, Brendan, we were talking about Asia overall. You were talking about domestic, talking about international. Asia Pacific is a great aviation market. It's really interesting. Two of the top cities, I've lived in both of them, Hong Kong for 10 years and now Singapore for 10 years, have really been hammered. Cathay, even if you take away the China market, it has no domestic market, even though now it's, part of China. Singapore Airlines, obviously no domestic market at all. What's in store for these two airlines? Singapore's kind of coming back in fits and starts. Cathay's got China to depend on. What can we look at them? Because these are two really iconic airlines.
Yeah, and they obviously, they're definitely in a similar category because of the lack of domestic markets, and relying entirely on international traffic and particularly international network traffic. So they're very unique in that respect. Maybe like Emirates, of course, is similar, but in terms of Asia, they're completely reliant. They're really the only ones that are completely reliant on that kind of traffic. They're somewhat in the same category, but they're also kind of diverging now because the situation in Singapore is very different than the situation in Hong Kong. Now, Hong Kong's situation is much more concerning, much more severe, just because they still have the COVID zero strategy. They've had all these issues with crew requirements and so forth that have been very well publicized and extremely concerning, extremely frustrating, even for anybody in the aviation industry is really feeling for people in Hong Kong right now, particularly in the aviation community and among the airline crew. It doesn't show any signs of getting better. It's going to be several months at least before they get out of this COVID zero and out of the current predicament they are in. And of course, Hong Kong was already struggling before COVID because of the protests and the political uncertainty there. So there's a lot of question marks about the future of Hong Kong as a hub. And it has nothing, CAPA, of course, it's not outside their control. So it's not, Cathay is obviously a very strong airline, a very strong brand, but the situation in Hong Kong, they're completely reliant on, and it's outside of their control. So it's quite frustrating situation and quite uncertain still. While in Singapore, I think we have the opening's definitely gone very slowly initially, and it started very very late, especially given the the high vaccination rate in Singapore. But at least it's kind of going in the right direction. Singapore Airlines is close to 50% capacity, pre-COVID, which is a very high level, particularly given the fact that they rely entirely on the international market. And of course, demand is even with the VTLs is way below that. They're still, their load factors are still in the 20 percentiles. So it's, and they're relying a lot on cargo and on government support still. So it's not all rosy, but at least there's a strategy there, and they're coming back. While CAPA is still down, like 97%, and their capacity is still way down as well. It's nowhere near Singapore's capacity. So. Both airlines are divergent in some respect, but certainly during the pandemic have been impacted in similar ways.
Okay. Let's move down under a little bit. You recently wrote a paper on the Australian market. To me, it's really interesting what's happening down there. It's gone from basically shut down domestically and internationally almost a year ago. And when all of that was happening, we saw airlines like Rex decide to take advantage of the crisis, never let a good crisis go to waste. And they started adding planes to their inventory to compete with Virgin and Qantas. And now we've seen Bonza. I don't know about the name, but they're about to launch in the LCC space. So that market looks like it's going to grow in spite of everything that's happening.
Yeah, I mean, Australia is a very interesting market. Obviously, it's been more impacted than others during the pandemic. And the paper came out early November, just when we kind of were in the beginning of the new phase for Australia. So they opened up internationally, as well as some of the states started opening up domestically, just only in the beginning of November. But until November, the market was performing extremely poorly. I mean, especially given that case numbers were always pretty low in Australia. But and not only international, they had this controversial policy of not letting people leave the country, and had this cap on inbound arrivals, which meant that traffic was down even more than other countries. But of course, international was down everywhere quite severely. But domestically was really the laggard. I mean, Australia domestic market should have been performing well during the pandemic, but it wasn't because of this unusual situation where the states kind of control the quarantine and control the borders. So basically it was like 7 international markets rather than 1 domestic market, and you only had travel for the most part like within the states, which is pretty limited. There is some domestic within Queensland and Western Australia, and there was a little bit of travel between some of the states that were zero COVID, but like Victoria and New South Wales in particular, they were basically shut down for most of the time, and they have limited intrastate markets. So it was very limited, and the domestic market, as the paper pointed out, in Australia was down more than any other domestic market or any other major domestic market in the world, even though in theory it should have been one of the better performing ones given COVID to containment. And that was just political and really unfortunate policies that were in place that did that. And now we have a new phase with the beginning of November, fortunately, with starting with New South Wales and Victoria, reaching that 80% and now 90% figures, which allowed them to open up domestically as well as allow international travel again. Although it's been set back by the new variant, of course, because they've reimposed 3-day quarantine again. But at least it was moving in the right direction. And now Queensland, just yesterday, they went forward and opened up domestically, and they're going to open up internationally in a month, I guess. Which is encouraging because, a lot of people were concerned Queensland wouldn't actually kind of open up like they were supposed to, especially when the new variant emerged. But they have gone forward. They're letting the virus in. Yesterday, they, basically with the domestic market opening in Queensland to the rest of Australia, particularly Victoria and New South Wales, where they were closed for so long, the virus is coming into Queensland now, which allows them to go from pandemic to endemic and allows them to join the rest of Australia in the reopening, which is very encouraging. And now that leaves Western Australia, which also yesterday, obviously the pressure is mounting there because they're the last ones left. They're saying they're going to do the same thing, with opening up both domestically and international at the beginning of February. Again, letting the virus in and finally, abandoning their COVID zero strategy. So assuming that goes to plan, Australia will be in a good position after that. Both domestically and internationally. They have a lot to catch up on, though, because they lost a lot of ground in that period of months and months where they weren't letting in any international traveler, and they had so many domestic, restrictions. So, people's confidence have to come back. Passenger confidence is a huge issue everywhere. But in Australia, because all these borders that kept on opening and closing for so long, people just lost the confidence to even go domestically, and that has to build back. And right now, it looks good, but until people see it in place for a few months, maybe they'll be a bit reluctant to travel. But certainly, the indications there are more positive than they were, but it's still a long road in their recovery.
Let's move a little bit closer to home for us. Indonesia, you just came out with another paper on Indonesia. That market it's an interesting market to me. I mean, you've got a huge population there. You got a lot of young people. Incomes are growing. Unfortunately, domestic airlines haven't really had the best track record with safety and things like that. But I was scanning over your paper. You talk about IATA predicting that the country is going to be the world's fourth largest aviation market by 2037, but that's sooner than everybody thinks. Tell us a little bit about the market there, and is it as big domestically as it should be?
Yeah, I mean, Indonesia is a massive market. I mean, it's one of the most populated countries in the world. It's so they reached 100 million in 2018. Then they had a contraction in 2019, and of course, then COVID decimated the market like everywhere else. And Indonesia is people I think don't understand it. There's a lack of appreciation for the fact that Indonesia is mainly domestic market. The airlines there, do very well. From a marketing perspective and from a distribution perspective, domestically. But that's their main market, and the market behaves a lot differently than other countries, and that's going to continue to be the case. A lot of people point to trends going on globally, and there will be changes in Indonesia because the young population there is large and it's growing and has more discretionary income, and that new generation will drive some changes in passenger expectations, But I think Indonesia will continue to evolve differently than the rest of the world. So the paper is quite interesting, and encourage everybody to have a read on it because it looks at how Indonesia was, performing before the pandemic, how it's impacted, but also looks at the future and how it might evolve, in terms of future airline strategies. And I think, there's a lot. This year is going to be a very interesting year. Frankly, it will return. It's a resilient market. The domestic recovery has been slow there, the numbers, but also because the government has been very conservative. Even very recently with the new variant, they're put back in domestic travel restrictions. That is unfortunately kind of killing some of the momentum and some of the recovery for the Christmas and end of the year season. But I think next year, as the vaccination rate improves, there's really there's very resilient. The people there want to travel, and they have to travel because of the geography. After prior crises, they always came back quite quickly, and I think it will come back. And also, it's also interesting because we have airlines restructuring. Some of them are still very much in the process of restructuring, like Garuda, a lot of uncertainty. But we also have new airlines coming. So Super Airjet launched in August. Obviously, that's part of the Lion family, but quite interesting and very ambitious. We have Polita launching probably in March, and we have Transnusa, which was previously just small, like regional airline operating regional aircraft, and then was suspended during the pandemic. They're coming back with A320s. They just took their first A320 last week, and they're going to be launching probably in February. So we're going to have 3 new competitors on trunk route. So it's going to be quite interesting. Indonesia was a very competitive market several years ago with lots of kind of smaller, colorful airlines, and of course it's a market of interest because it's just so large. It's 100 million passengers domestically, and then international also has a lot of potential, but from a much smaller base, obviously. So it's manufacturers, suppliers. The whole industry internationally is looking at Indonesia, and and I think it's going to be an interesting market to watch, and it will come back, especially domestically. So again, the recovery is going to be domestic focused initially, globally and in Asia Pacific. So Indonesia is sitting on one of the largest domestic markets. Indonesian carriers, sitting on this huge, massive domestic market, and generally reliant mostly on domestic. They have an advantage over maybe a lot of foreign airlines because a lot of foreign airlines are more reliant on international. So it should be an interesting year for Indonesia, and definitely a market to watch. And I encourage everybody to read the paper, of course.
Let's move still in Southeast Asia, but let's talk about markets that are interesting to me. Malaysia, of course, we've got AirAsia there. Vietnam's got Vietjet, Vietnam Airlines as well, that are still pretty good. Cambodia seems to be upping its aviation game with new airports. And I also read the other day there might be a new domestic airline starting up there. Very quickly, give us sort of the big picture, the helicopter view of what's happening in those three markets.
Yeah, so I mean, they're all different markets, quite different sizes, behaving differently before and after the pandemic. But I mean, generally speaking, there's a lot of opportunity. There's a lot of, there's a lot of airlines that are, want to add back capacity as soon as possible because they have the aircraft, they have the staff, they have all these, assets, and there's a lot of pressure, I think, financially to try to get back, boost up utilization, get back in the air as much as possible. So what that does is it results in very intense competition, and I think we'll see that in all three of the markets you mentioned, as well as other markets in Southeast Asia. For that reason, you have the existing airlines. We haven't had many airline failures during this crisis because the industry has worked together with the airlines to make sure that they survive and restructure financially. So these airlines are all still around and they're ready to really want to get back their capacity back. And then you have new airlines as well launching, some of which are about to launch or are planning to launch. So you have a lot of the prospect of intense competition is really there, which is good for consumers, but it's also going to make it tough for airlines because a lot of the markets, including the ones you mentioned, were suffering from overcapacity prior to COVID, and that overcapacity issue is not likely to go away as the market recovers. A lot of capacity will come back. You'll have new competitors in some cases. So it's going to be kind of a challenging period, I think. I think hopefully demand will come back, but there's a lot of uncertainty about the recovery in demand, particularly international. But the main concern, I would say, is the overcapacity. That we're going to have a lot of aggressive and irrational competition again in the region, which will make it hard for airlines to return to profitability. And a lot of these airlines were not profitable before COVID because of the overcapacity and irrational competition. But obviously, now they're in a position where they really have to become profitable at some point in the next few years because the debt and all their financial obligations. So it's going to be an interesting period in that because how will airlines be able to survive if they don't return to profitability in the next few years?
Yeah, it's amazing to me. I mean, I don't think people realize how thin the margins are on a per passenger basis. I was, before COVID, all the conferences that you and I used to go to, I remember hearing somebody talk about the profit margin per passenger is about $10 US. And the guy had a great line. He said, we're a hamburger and a Coke away from losing money on that passenger, just because the margins are so small. Brendan, we're running a little bit short on time. Couple of last questions. India is one of my favorite countries. I've been traveling there since the late 80s, early 90s. You have to embrace the chaos a little bit. It can be overwhelming at times. Do you keep an eye on India at all? What do you think about that market?
Yeah, I mean, it's very, like Indonesia, it's a very resilient market, and the domestic market was recovering quite nicely before Delta, which really struck it hard, obviously, but it's recovered again. It's a very resilient market, a very strong domestic market, and it will come back. It's similar to Indonesia, or even faster than Indonesia potentially, and it is a bit bigger than Indonesia as well. So again, and internationally, also they've actually done better than other Asia Pacific markets in terms of recovery of international because they've reopened earlier, and they also rely a lot on kind of the VFR and worker segments. So those segments are segments that are recovering faster. So India is definitely a strong market. Of course, airline profitability has been an issue there, and there's consolidation, and new, a lot of changes with Air India, with Tata now. So and question marks over AirAsia India, for example. But so there's a lot of uncertainty with the airline situation, and it's going to be difficult for the overall sector to return to profitability or actually become profitable for the first time in many years. But from a growth perspective, similar, definitely a recovery perspective definitely is definitely one to watch, and to one that should perform quite well in next year, actually.
Okay. Last question. We're running short on time. I always try to end these shows on a bright note. Again, things were looking up. Borders were starting to reopen. Omicron variant came along. Still a great name for a Star Trek episode. Barring a complete cure or a super vaccine or something like that, what can the Asian aviation world look forward to as we head into the new year?
Yeah, well, I think I think we can look forward to definitely a better year than 2021, I think the industry just needs to keep on rallying. It's come together quite well within the industry in terms of leasing companies, suppliers, manufacturers. They really worked well with the airlines in Asia Pacific to avoid doomsday scenarios. So I was mentioning there has been very little failures in Asia Pacific, despite what people were predicting at the beginning. So I think that's going to have to continue to be the case, because we're going to have more setbacks, more new variants, and it's just not going to be a straight linear curve. So the industry is going to have to continue to come together and work together, and I think what we need to look forward to more is more consensus, more pushing the governments, the industry coming together from a perspective of working with the governments and trying to get the government's attention, to try to move to the next phase, because the governments so far have been very focused on their own country, on their own situation, but now that we're kind of moving to an endemic stage, I think there'll be more bandwidth to engage with the governments to kind of resolve some of these issues we were talking about earlier. So I think that's what we need to look forward to 2022, and fingers crossed we will see momentum in that key area, because again, without it we will never recover the international market.
Yeah, I'm ready to travel again. Brendan Sobie, head of Sobie Aviation here in Singapore. Thanks for joining me in conversation.
Thanks, Matt.